Believe it or not, gray can be one of the trickiest colors to master inside of a user interface because there can be so many different variations. And most projects that you work on are gonna have multiple shades of gray because you need to account for dark text, medium gray text, icon colors, light gray backgrounds, or some light gray dividers. So there's a lot of times you can kind of go overboard. If you're not really keeping your gray colors in check, you might end up with multiple different colors and they're just slightly different across multiple different screens. So it's always best to kind of come up with 3 to 5, maybe a few more if you have a few different color schemes, but come up with a very solid, strict kind of system to deal with your grays and know that going into your project before you get too scattered. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. I've taken screenshots from Twitter, Facebook, Gmail, and Pinterest, and I have captured their colors in these little swatches here. So I've got the hex code and the HSB value so we can take a look at the differences between all of the colors and the grays. So Twitter is a pretty simple example here. You have your basic Twitter blue, then you have your darker color here, your dark text, which you can see in the side navigation, and also in the usernames, and also on the actual tweets. Then they have a secondary gray, this 687785. This is going to be used for some of this metadata, like the username and the timestamp of the tweet. This color is also used for the icons and the label, the count of retweets, comments, likes, and so on and so forth. Then, so we've got our dark gray and our medium gray, and this is passing AA text, by the way. We also have this lighter gray. This is really light gray, this E6EBEF. This is going to be used for these divider lines. So we've got this really light divider line here, and even this one, this big block of color, it looks darker because there's more of the color, but it's actually the same exact hex code. So that's just a much larger border kind of separating the timeline between the kind of tweet box here. But it is the same exact color, even though this one looks a little darker. And then we've got our last gray here that is F4, F6, F8, and that's the background of this little trends for you area. So we've got the light gray there, and then they're reusing the same gray that we have number 4 here. They're reusing that same gray as dividers on that little background. So all in all, you can look at and they're using white for the background, so I threw that in there. But look at the hue values. It's very, very close. 208, 210, 209, 207, 210. Now it's not 100% evident if they were using hex codes or HSB values or some other mechanism for choosing the color, but they've done a really good job keeping all of these grays in the cool blue kind of Twitter family. So a lot of things it feels like it goes together because the hues are so very similar. And then they've adjusted the saturation and the brightness of each one to just kind of create a nice looking color palette. So moving on to Facebook, kind of a similar color palette, but you can tell this is a little bit muted because they're not using the white background like Twitter is. So I've pulled in their grays and kind of the same thing. You've got the brand blue, and then you have your slightly darker blue here, but then you got your dark text, your medium gray, and then you've got your darker gray that they're using for some of these background colors. For example, this gray and this gray, they look different, but it's the only thing that's making it look different is this border. And that's one way that you can create a little bit more of a use for one color is having a secondary color and sometimes using it as a border, sometimes not. So a pretty nice example from Facebook as well. All right, then we get to Gmail. Gmail. What have you done? I'm not exaggerating here. These are all of the grays, and it's likely that I may have missed some, but these are all the grays and the variations that I actually found from this screenshot of Gmail. So you can see just from looking at these swatches that there is a variety of kind of warmer, these darker color grays. These are all pretty warm with the exception of this one. This one is kind of a bluish color. And then there's kind of a variety of warm and blue grays inside of here. And one of the biggest ways to tell the difference, if you can't quite make it out with your just purely visually, you can see that all of these grays that are in the 200 hue range that do have some saturation and brightness, this is going to be in the blue color realm. So anything with a 200 or so hue is going to be right in this bluish kind of purple area. So if we look, this one's 206 and it looks much bluer than the 180 on this one. So if we open this up, we can see 180 is it's actually on this teal blue color spectrum, but they've got the saturation pulled all the way out. So it's naturally going to look a little warmer. Most of the neutral grays will kind of appear like a warmer gray compared to the cooler grays. Same thing with this. But then you get back to the 200 range blue and it's gonna feel a little cooler. So the ones that are 0 are gonna feel a lot different than the ones that have a hue at 200, simply because that hue is at a different range and it's gonna produce a slightly different effect. Now, I don't know what was going on at Google when they designed this. This is a really, really old product, and I would imagine that there have been multiple teams working on this, because you do have this consistent number 4 color. You've got the number 4 color for this icon. You've got some of the text over here, like the timestamps. You've got the secondary text for the first line of the email. But then you've got weird things like this inbox area. This is a very warm gray on top of this very cool gray. And it kind of creates a lot of odd color combinations. So, and even this right here, this number 14, this is a very, very different gray than this is right here. And then you've got a very different gray for these checkboxes. So there's a ton of variation going on here. Now, I don't mind this design so much, but once I got in here and really started analyzing the grays, it was painful to continue producing all of these swatches. And if you get in here and you really start digging in, these blue borders are slightly different than this desaturated gray border. And it's just a ton of unnecessary hex codes that are being used. And again, I'm not trying to fault anyone at Gmail, because it's probably an older product that has old code for the inbox system, maybe some new code for some of the new designs, and it's getting all mashed together. So, but it's just a great example of what happens if you don't really get a handle of your grays. And let's move on to the Pinterest example right over here, which does an amazing job with just very few grays. So if you look down at this color palette, they really only have these 3 colors right here. This 5th one is really the only variation that I could find, which is really only a variation of this color. So this color right here, number 5, is a 25% version of number 3. So if we look at this kind of zooming out, we've got 3 basic colors. We have our dark text, which is the number 2 here, dark text here, dark text here. I didn't label it, but you have your dark text right here and your dark text right here. So a pretty consistent usage of dark text. Even this 14 pins, 14 weeks ago, all of this is that same color, the pound 333. Very common go-to kind of dark text without making everything look so dark and contrasty. It's kind of like a nice charcoaly color. Then we have our second gray, number 3 here. They're using that for these icons here, and they're using that for the secondary navigation items up here, and they're also using it for these icons over here. And then what's interesting, it almost appears like this drag and drop button. This is the only thing that kind of feels out of place, because they're using a lot of big, blocky, kind of full background. Even though it's a light gray, it's kind of this chunky feel, and they're not using a lot of this dainty, thin call to action style. This one button feels slightly out of place just in terms of their overall style. But, and look, this also looks darker. This looks darker than that icon. But remember from one of our other lessons, these colors are going to appear differently depending on what is surrounding them. So this gray is surrounded by a light background or kind of a darker background than the white. So even though these are the exact same hex code, and you can see that if I just draw a rectangle and make this color the same, you can see that This is the exact same color here, but it just appears a little bit different on this side because it's surrounded by slightly different colors. But overall, they do a really, really good job of providing lots and lots of variety with just these 3 different grays. The one area that starts to get a little bit questionable though is this last save to. This is gonna be that 8E color. And while it might work for some of these bigger, bolder colors because it's a really thick font, it's a lot more readable. Some of these thinner weights, to me, I don't think that that's really gonna fly very well. You can see this, I've got the contrast already checked here. This is a 3.28, so it is passing AA large, but really with a font that small, you'd want it to be a 4.5. So I could see them introducing this 777 color as possibly a 3rd gray right in between here. So if we took this, move that over, they could very easily add this in as a darker gray. And actually this should be probably switched with that one because it's a little bit darker. So this could be their AAA dark score, their AA medium gray score, and then their AA large score for some of these bigger items and some of this iconography. But overall, Pinterest does a really good job just in general for a very conservative usage of their gray color, which is a huge leap from what Gmail is doing with theirs. But you can see there's a lot of different styles with these colors. This one is kind of, these warmer desaturated grays kind of goes along with the red color scheme that Pinterest has with their logo and the same color they're using for some of their other accent colors. Whereas something like Facebook has a lot more of a hue associated with their individual colors. So you can see, again, all of these are in the same kind of hue color space. And Twitter does a similarly good job with having theirs inside of that color space. And I didn't really point this out as one of the examples, but one of the worst things that you could do with a color gray is have a big full color background or some kind of very colorful background and then just use a random gray on top of it. You're always going to want to use the same hue variant of that color and then bring down the darkness or the opacity, or at the very least use the color black and use the opacity all the way down. That way some of the color bleeds through the border or the background or whatever you're trying to produce. Never use that fully desaturated gray on top of a color because it's just gonna look really, really weird. For homework, let's get a calculator design going, whether it's a desktop calculator or an iOS style calculator. I've got some examples posted down here. So what I want you to do is, once you have one kind of laid out like you like it, try 3 different variations. One with a neutral gray where there's absolutely no saturation in any of the colors whatsoever, and you're only using this kind of grayscale, black and white color scheme. Then for your second one, duplicate that and then start to add in either a warm primary color or a cool primary color, some kind of color of your choosing for some of the more colorful buttons like the equal sign and all of those. And then try to mimic that hue inside of all the other grays. Maybe even make a copy with the desaturated grays and the saturated grays just so you can see the difference. And then for your third version, make something that is completely colorful, full color background, full color equal sign button. So maybe you play with some complementary colors and then try to redo the grays again where you're not using desaturated grays, but you're using very intentional either black or white with opacity on top of the background color, or you're picking that one hue that you're using as the background to kind of play with the gray range inside of the different buttons, the dividers, any other kind of gray thing that you're using in your designs. So it should be a fun little exercise. Design the calculators, get your colors going, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.